Um, but yeah,
All right, we're all set.
perfect. Well, again, hello everyone, and welcome to our FRAC lunch discussion on contract office efficiencies and metrics. My name is Rebecca Hannis, and I'm an assistant director in the contracts office at the University of Central Florida. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two discussion group leaders for today, my wonderful colleagues, Jeffrey Warner and Stiliana Jayasingham, both in the contracts office at the University of Central Florida. Jeff is currently the director of the contracts office, and our office is responsible for the negotiation and execution of funded and unfunded agreements associated with sponsored projects. He previously served as the Director of Ancillary Research Agreements at the University of California, San Diego, where he managed a team of contract officers responsible for a variety of research contract service lines, including both unfunded and service agreements. Stiliana is currently a Contracts Officer 3 in the Contracts Office, also at the University of Central Florida. She previously worked at the University of Alabama in Huntsville as a service manager, being part of a team administering a government contract with the U.S. Army Acquisition Center for Excellence. Stiliana is passionate about traveling, and she loves to discover new places and experiences, especially trying new cuisines. So thank you again, Stiliana and Jeff, for leading this discussion group. A couple of logistical matters for all of our participants. As you heard, the session is being recorded, and the recordings will be made available after the conference for those who are interested. Additionally, these lunch discussions are intended to be informal and interactive, so please feel free. We encourage you all to participate as much as you would like and join in the conversation. You are also welcome and encouraged to place your comments or questions in the chat. I will be monitoring that as the session proceeds so that I can share those messages throughout the session. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jeff and Stiliana.
Thank you so much, Becca. It's really exciting to see a lot of familiar names here in the chat and some new names as well. As Becca mentioned, the goal of this discussion is to be an informal conversation about efforts to improve efficiencies in contracts offices and what metrics we should be using to measure the effectiveness of those efficiencies. I think it's a great topic for us to discuss as peers so that we can share our knowledge and best practices. It's exciting as we all use and implement new electronic research administration systems. We have access to better data. And we can use that data to improve our processes. We can look at our policies and even use that for our training for the staff. One thing to note here that I think it's important to start with is that when we're looking at efficiencies in a contracts office and how to measure those efficiencies with metrics, we need to consider the needs and interests of the institutional leadership, but we also need to consider the needs and interests of the contracts officers who are actually working on the agreements. It's an important balance. The contracts officers are the ones who are in the trenches working through the contracts on a daily basis. They have great insight into the daily workload of a contracts officer. They have great feedback for any opportunities to improve processes. And I think it's one of the most important parts of looking at efficiencies and developing that feedback loop with your staff, making sure that they feel comfortable engaging with you, providing feedback, letting you know when something is not working. Nothing is worse than implementing something new, something you think is going to be a positive change and it not working well. And the only way to remedy that is to quickly pivot and change. So developing a feedback loop with your staff, building that trust, and communicating the interests of leadership to them in a way that they understand, making sure they understand the overall goals of the office and they share and buy into those goals. Not only must we balance, contracts officers' interests and leadership interests, but we also must balance an efficient contract negotiation timeline with safeguarding our universities against unnecessary risk. We all could get our contracts executed, within 24 hours if we weren't reviewing them. We weren't looking for problematic terms and conditions or areas for risk. So we need to balance, that timeline with, making sure that we're capturing the compliance issues, making sure that we're negotiating terms and conditions that align with university policies, federal regulations. Again, you're kind of walking this fine line, and what it requires is a lot of analysis and adjustment, looking at what works, what doesn't work, what's high risk, what's low risk. So, getting into the first area here is, strategies for identifying efficiency. So we can all say we want a more efficient contracts office. We want our contracts officers to be able to work through an agreement very quickly and facilitate the research for the investigators on campus. I mean, that's the overall goal. We want that research to get started as quickly as possible. How can you start looking at what efficiencies you can gain? Well, I think looking at data. Data is the starting point when developing these process improvements. Analyzing data on when a contract enters and exits each stage of the negotiation process. For example, when is a contract received by the institution? When is a contract sent to any compliance partners for their input? When is the first red line sent out to a sponsor? Pulling regular samples of agreements to review their negotiation timeline can provide you insight into the timeline of these events. So first question to the group, again, please feel free to respond in the chat, unmute, turn on your video. This is supposed to be a collaborative discussion here. Is what are some strategies your institution has used to identify opportunities to change processes, procedures, and policies to improve the negotiation timeline? I can certainly speak from personal experience with the contracts office. We've had a lot of focus on this area over the last year. Sure, Becca, would you be able to put the question here? Great comment here. Using the FTP template as much as possible. I think that's an opportunity that we're all looking towards. Using templates. What can we do to start with our preferred position? It's always more challenging to negotiate a contract from the preferred position of the other party. So starting with a template that's approved by your university is a great way to start. One of the things I noticed at a lot of institutions, including the University of Central Florida, is that we're posting those templates online. We want to advertise those templates and make them easy for our sponsors and the other parties to use. So let's make them publicly available. Let's advertise them with our customers. This is something new for the University of Central Florida. We just started working through this process and getting these out to our customers in a more public forum. But that's another way, putting out, your sponsor research agreements, your CDAs, your MTAs, making that information and those documents easily available.
Jeff, we have a couple of other comment suggestions in the chat as well. One is we have removed general counsel from the review. Another is working with ancillary reviewers to streamline processes and minimize the necessity for multiple reviews by the same office. And we have a third one come in from Jessica. Reorganized files based on the agency and company name. It makes it easier to be consistent with our requested edits.
Absolutely. I think those are all really great suggestions. Going back to the point about duplicative reviews, we spend a lot of time looking at some of the compliance reviews that we have, what their areas, what they're looking at, and making sure that any sort of overlap is addressed, and making, focusing each reviewer's attention on their area of responsibility and not having their scope of the review expand past their area of responsibility. We had one compliance area that was focused on, making sure that certain protocols were in place depending on the research, where they were also looking at contract language, which wasn't exactly in their area of responsibility. So we're trying to streamline that. We're trying to make sure that everyone is staying within their lane so that we're not spending time duplicating efforts.
We've got an additional comment from Roxana, identifying risks to minimize business escalations.
Developing a risk matrix, working with your general counsel, your your risk management office, providing some tools and resources for the staff to make sure that they're identifying risk appropriately and reaching out to those stakeholders who are going to be affected by that risk, and making sure they understand and accept that risk is important and actually moves it along much quicker. It also has a double benefit in the sense that you're going to be dealing with less on the back end if everyone has an opportunity to comment from the beginning. I'd like to get more into some of the data questions here. So at your institution, do you have an electronic research administration system that provides you the opportunity to track these sorts of ins and outs for the contract negotiation timeline? Are you able to accurately measure how long it takes a certain area of your campus to review a contract, whether it's your contracts officer, or it's an area of compliance, or it's the department, the PI, and even the external party? Is there a way for you to easily track that data, easily pull that data and analyze it on a regular basis? We actually,
in the chat as well.
thank you, Becca.
Yeah,
We have a very advanced system here at the University of Central Florida, and an IT support staff that understands our needs to be able to pull this data on a regular basis. They've created reports for us that are easily pulled. We look at them on a regular basis and try to identify areas where there may be bottlenecks, looking at addressing those issues. You know, if the external party is taking a long time to review the document, what can we do there? If there's an internal party that's taking a longer time to review a contract, what can we do with them to make sure that they're moving as quickly as they can? So we pull that data. We can actually provide an overview for our leadership on exactly how long it takes each of these points of contact during the negotiation process to review a document. It sets expectations, and you know, there's a lot of benefits that we'll get into later about looking at that data. If you have access to this data, are your institutions pulling it on a regular basis?
we've got a question in the chat from David. Is this system an out-of-the-box product? Do you mind sharing the name, or is this something that UCF developed?
I'm happy to praise the electronic research administration we have here. It's Huron Research Suite. I've worked at multiple institutions in my career, and I have to say that Huron Research Suite, in my experience, is the most intuitive. And the support that we have on our IT side to put together these reports that we can pull ourselves. We don't require any sort of special support, and you know, we let them know what we want to look at. We provide them feedback. They've made some changes for us in terms of identifying each area of compliance review so that we can easily look at those particular contracts that are being sent to those areas. So it's advanced, it's easy to use, and even for research administrators that don't have a lot of experience pulling and analyzing data, the system that we have here at the University of Central Florida and the reports that have been developed make it very easy for us to quickly look at it. We pull it on a regular basis because it's so easy. We're looking at certain issues weekly, monthly, and quarterly. So we've done quarterly, even more frequent, that pulls of overall negotiation timeline data. We look at weekly reports on the pending contracts that we have. We look at volume. What do our contracts officers have on their plate right now? Do we need to shift anything around? Is there all of a sudden a peak or a spike in volume for a particular officer? If so, what kind of support can we provide them in making sure, again, that volume isn't a bottleneck for our contracts?
We've got a comment in the chat from Catherine. I've been at 2 institutions with 2 different paid ERA systems, but the ability to pull data and metrics is heavily on our institute to build a reporting system that can run side by side. Great once up and running, but a lot of effort and money on the front end.
I completely understand. There's a lot of effort and resources that are put in on the front end, and it's paying dividends for us right now. The effort that went into developing these reports makes it so that as a leadership team, we can use data to support our decisions. So we're making evidence-based decisions. We're not just basing it on conversations. We're not basing it on our gut feeling. We're actually using data to support the direction of the office. And so I would have to say that it's a huge investment, but it has paid out very well for us. So going on to the next question, based on the comments in the chat, this sort of data may not be available to all institutions. If this information is not available at your institution, are there any efforts underway to develop such reporting tools or resources so that you can look at this data? At previous institutions, it was a balance of trying to make sure you're not putting too much additional administrative burden on the contracts officers, where they're tracking all of these different changes and trying to automate it as much as possible, because that's important. You want to make sure that the effort that goes into the data doesn't, sort of overwhelm the officers so that, they're delaying the negotiation because they're spending so much time, tracking things in the system. The way that we handle these right now, it's very automated. You click things over to a certain status. It's an external review, it's an internal review, it's with this particular office. So it all tracks those data points, and we're able to pull that. So at your institutions, are you collaborating with your IT groups or your leadership to develop these reporting tools? And if so, what strategies have helped you, focus their attention on this issue as a priority? I know that I'm sure many of us here are involved in a lot of reporting requests from leadership on their campuses. So one of the strategies that is really helpful to use when working with leadership is trying to communicate in a way that they see benefit. So you can obviously sell the point that it's going to help us improve our negotiation timeline, which is always important for leadership. But there's also another benefit too, is that we're all moving into more requirements for reporting on certain contracts on a regular basis, semi-annually, annually. Depending on what institution you're at, where you're located in the United States, you may need to pull reports on a regular basis of what types of contracts you're working on, what entity they're with. So you can use this as an efficiency tool, but you're also going to be using it for some of the compliance that we have with these reporting requirements from state and federal government agencies.
We've got another comment in the chat. We have a ticketing system to request a new report to be built.
Absolutely. And, when working with IT, letting them know what sort of impact that report will have on your daily operations, I think helps them understand how to prioritize the development of such a report. I can't say enough positive things about the IT support we have here at the University of Central Florida. They understand our business. They understand, what we're trying to achieve here. Communicating your goals as an office to the IT group so that they can understand and share your vision.
Okay, we've got another question in the chat, and bear with me because this is a longer one. When pulling this data, how do you account for the delay time when you are working on other contracts? For example, you are working on one and waiting on a sponsor to agree to the changes, but it takes a couple of days. In the meantime, you start to work on another one, and you may not be able to get back to the first one when it comes back, and delaying it more. If you were not working on a second one, you might get back to the first one quicker. So where a 2-day review might now turn into a 5-day review.
I think that's an issue as contracts officers we deal with on a daily basis, trying to manage those new contracts that come in with those that you're already working on. As we get further along in this conversation, we'll talk about other strategies to help manage some of those follow-up requirements, looking at what we can do to help the external party respond quicker. But it really is a balance, making sure that you're not neglecting those contracts that are already in negotiation for newer contracts and not negotiating something to come, to execution before you get to the next contract. So you have to develop a way to manage those competing priorities so that you keep all of the contracts moving along. And I think, Becca, you put this very well in a couple of different conversations we have. Keep the agreements moving. That's a huge priority for an office. Keep them moving. We're doing our best to be as diligent as possible in negotiating the best in terms and conditions as we can, but we need to keep the agreements moving. So Stiliana, you have a really great point to add here about some of the benefits of data and how it can help a contracts office tell their story.
Yes, hi everybody. So from contracting officer standpoint, the biggest plus for me was that the data we was able to gather started giving value to what we do on an everyday basis. Because let's face it, as contracting officers, or we're the ones negotiating the contracts, we were the biggest pain in the behind for the PIs, because they always complained of how we're holding the process, we're unnecessarily stopping them from doing their work. We all have gotten emails from principal investigators saying, I don't understand why we can't just sign this. Why do you have to look at it? And that's great. I mean, they don't have to know what we're doing, but with the new system that we implemented and with the data that we were able to pull from there, we can actually show what we do on a regular basis, what the negotiation process takes. And we actually were able to make it faster. And not only that, but now with the new system, the principal investigators actually have access to the same system as we do. So at any given point, they can look where the records are, at what state they are, and how far they are from negotiations or from completion. So with the data that we have had so far, we managed to cut the negotiation process probably, I would say, a third, Jeff. So that means that all these projects and all these proposals that keep giving, helping the PIs are actually put in place much quicker. And of course, we all know that if the PIs are happy, the departments are happy, and if the departments are happy, our Office of Research is happy. So it worked out great in that sense. Before that, we had to work with 5 different systems, and I feel some of you that made comments that they don't have systems that talk to each other, and it was very difficult to keep track on the progress. It was pretty much on the contracting officer to keep track of everything that they were doing. So yes, the new data, the new system has helped us a lot from that point of view.
And Stiliana, that's a great point. Not only, is there this data to help tell our story, but there's also, because we've structured the electronic research administration in such a way, it provides transparency into our process, minimizing the amount of follow-up that we receive from those customers that we're supporting on the campus. Because they have insight as to where we are with a particular contract, they can help themselves. They can, check in the system, look to see where something is. Obviously, they're going to follow up with us if they want to have more information, sort of background on, the status that's in, but it helps minimize the follow-up and the communications. Another thing, Stiliana, about this data and telling our story, you mentioned, the reduction in the negotiation timeline. If you're tracking your negotiation timeline and you implement efficiencies that have a positive impact and reduce the time from receipt to execution, you have the ability to communicate that to leadership. At opportunities such as an all-hands meeting for the Office of Research, talking about where you were a year ago versus where you are this year, and being able to brag about the contracts office staff, letting them know how great of a job everyone is doing, I think really, improves the, opinion of the contracts office of a central office at an institution.
We've got another in the chat related to the time saving and efficiencies. Does anyone intentionally block time on our calendars to assess the status or focus work on specific projects? I think this would help, and I've used it in other areas of my work. This will protect your time and remind you to check the status. If it doesn't take the whole of the block time, you can move on to something else, but at least to get your eyes on it that day.
Yes, as a contracting officers, we usually do, at least at UCF, we have kind of a rule that when you receive something, you have to at least look at it in the next 24 hours. So at least you know how much time is going to take you, how complicated the contract is going to be, if it's just a no-cost extension versus, an actual confidentiality disclosure agreement or something more complicated. So we have actually, it was pretty much, we had consensus between all the contracting officers. We pretty much asked questions to see what will work for everybody and how everybody works. Everybody has a different way of approaching things, but kind of making that first approach universal helped with the overall time management for everybody.
Are there any other tools or approaches that people use to help manage the transactional work and special projects? Because I can speak from my own experience that it is very challenging to schedule out time or focus on some of these special projects that don't have as much of a deadline as these transactions do. And so it's easy for someone in a leadership position or someone working on a special project to focus so much on those transactional issues and not pay attention to the data analysis or the special projects that you're working on. And weeks and months can slip by before you're able to circle back to them.
We've got another question, or actually a couple questions and comments in the chat. The first is, thanks for that discussion. Are these general strengths or weaknesses for reporting based on the usual data, like when it came in, when it was executed, how many emails, etc.? Are there particular measures you would add if they weren't available?
So the data that we look at essentially dissects the negotiation timeline. We track when the agreement is received by our office. We track how long it's in internal review. We are also able to track how long an agreement is in review with each of our compliance partners. So if an agreement needs to go to export control, if an agreement needs to go to our cybersecurity group, we have the ability to pull the data on when an agreement was sent to them, when it was sent back. We also have the ability to pull out what comments they provided us. Are they approving this? Are they approving it with changes? Are they approving it without changes? And that comes out in our report as well. So we are not only able to, sort of track the average timeline for each of these reviews, we're also able to pull out the comments and see what sort of review they provided, what sort of issues they identified, and use that, in a number of different areas, including training. We also have a peer-to-peer training program. I think Stiliana can talk about that a little bit in more detail, but what we've done is use that too to see how we can make sure that our office is leveraging everyone's experience as best as we can. Previously, the contracts office relied heavily on the assistant directors and the director to conduct these second reviews for newer contracts officers. And as you can imagine, when you have a small leadership team in a contracts office with 16 individuals, that's a lot for the leadership team to work on while they're working on other issues as well. So the leadership team in the contracts office identified the opportunity to leverage the experience and expertise of the more senior contracts officers and allow them bring them into collaborating on this peer-to-peer training model. And that has created a significant reduction in that time, that part of the negotiation timeline. We implemented this change in June of 2021 and have seen a 70% reduction in the time it takes for a second review. Stiliana, would you like to add anything about that peer-to-peer training program and the data we use to measure the effectiveness?
Well, I think that the idea was absolutely fantastic. It was really a team effort for that. But before we implemented that change, we realized that second reviews are actually probably our second bottleneck in the negotiation process, because we had the data from previous contracts and we would see what other comments were done, but you always had questions and you always had to adjust it to your current situation, current contract. So we were waiting on our leadership to provide the input, as Jeff said. Well, once we actually started talking to each other, we all have certain experiences and we all have certain areas where we can understand topics better than others. And we decided we're going to put that to work for us. So we, even a simple chat, we implemented chat between the contracting officers, where you can put in an issue that you have with a contract, where you're asking about a comment, and all of a sudden everybody else's experiences started pouring in, which helps you move the negotiations further. We're like, okay, well, that makes sense. this person has dealt with similar situation, maybe I can just do this instead. And the fact that we all put all of our expertise together, all our resources, kind of helped us getting to know more things by learning from everybody else, and helped negotiations. And we didn't have to go to our leadership every time we had a question. I mean, we asked each other questions. And of course, there's always situations when you don't really know the answer, then you can ask further. But it's amazing the difference that it made to all of our negotiations.
We've got a number of additional great comments and questions in the chat. So I'll go through and pull some of those quickly. Following up on the discussion about the calendar reminders, Wendy suggests that she sets calendar reminders when she knows she is waiting on a follow-up item to remind her of a certain date to recheck and follow up with a sponsor or PI. The alerts are helpful in just triggering a reminder to you to send an email, to make the call, or et cetera, especially when balancing multiple items that have ongoing follow-up. Along the same lines, Jessica suggests that she has used those calendar blocks as well for specific reviews. She always tries to use it for reminding her to follow up on agreements that are with an agency. Both great suggestions. Ginger comments, tracking the number of emails would be very interesting. Emails can eat up a good block of time. Going back again to the calendar blocks, Amber agrees that they're great. She also uses the flagging system in her emails. We then have a question from David. What is your average turnaround time? On average, how many contracts does each negotiator have on their desk? I realize that complexity plays a major part in the turnaround times, external delays, et cetera. Do you want to take a stab at that one?
Absolutely. So discussing an average turnaround time is a question that comes up, regularly with leadership. How long does it take you to negotiate a contract? A simple question like that. And typically my response is it's a little more complicated than that. It's not fair to compare each contract equally and say, it takes us 2 weeks to negotiate a particular contract. What we do is we do measure that. We do look at average and median timelines for our negotiations, and we're looking at sort of regularly throughout the year and comparing it to the previous year at that same time, sort of trying to identify similar peaks in volume, maybe trends in the types of sponsors we're working with. But it's not something I like to respond to just flat out. It takes us X number of days. It goes into a little bit more detail. We're still definitely in progress on developing our analysis of contracts and timelines. And David, you make a great point. Complexity plays a major part in turnaround times. Complexity is one of those things that it's challenging to capture. We recently restructured the office in June of 2021 and took complexity at least at a high level into consideration for our agreement assignment. So looking at traditionally, what are the more complex agreement types? New sponsor research agreements, master research agreements, data use agreements. What are some of the less complex? Not always, but sometimes. Let's say modifications, incoming MTAs that utilize a template, CDAs. So looking at ways where we can identify from the very beginning the complexity of an agreement. That's definitely just phase one. We have a lot of plans to look at complexity, more thoroughly. So looking at ways, not just looking at, one thing of agreement type and volume of agreement and how we assign things. We're also going to be looking at, area of campus, sponsor type. We all know that certain sponsors are more challenging than others. Industry versus, another institute of higher education. Those are two different things to factor in, both in assignments and who should be working on a contract based on their experience, and also turnaround times. External delays is a major thing. Going on into some of the questions that I prepared for the group, I see analyzing your negotiation timeline is breaking it to two different parts. You have the internal part, so those things that you can control as an institution, such as compliance turnaround time, second review, initial review, those are things that are within your control. Then you have external opportunities. So how can you work better with the other party? What can you do to provide better rationale from the very beginning so they understand your position? Are you negotiating for the middle? What sort of areas of high risk do you have in a contract? What areas of low risk do you have in a contract? Where should you be spending your negotiation time? Really focusing the negotiation on those must-haves. Automated follow-up. Is there a way to institute automated follow-up or have some administrative support for follow-up? Focusing your contracts officer's attention on negotiating the contract and trying to minimize the amount of administrative work that they have so that they, again, can work to have that external party respond as quickly as possible. And going back to, the one question I didn't address. So on average, how many contracts does each negotiator have on their desk? We have different levels of contracts officers here at the University of Central Florida, and the contracts office leadership team reviews the pending queue for contracts on a regular basis. And we've developed sort of a natural threshold over time of what we should expect a contracts officer to have on their desk. But again, that doesn't take into consideration complexity. I definitely grew up through the ranks of a Central Research Administration office, and at points would get very frustrated when someone would say, you only have 5 contracts on your desk, and this other person has 15. Well, that other person has 15 agreements that utilize the Ftp template. I'm working on 5 industry contracts with challenging terms. You can't say, this number of contracts equals this number of contracts. It requires a conversation, but at least it's a starting point with the officer. How are you feeling? How is volume for you right now? Is everything going okay? It's a point of discussion. So we have sort of expectations in terms of what we anticipate to be on a contracts officer's desk, and we're looking at that on a weekly basis to see if there's any support that we can provide the contracts officers.
We've got some more great comments and questions in the chat. We've got a couple of comments in favor of using Friday as a follow-up day, kind of a Friday follow-up. Also, Elizabeth suggests that when she reviews agreements that were last updated in your current system and works from the bottom up to check for follow-ups. We also have another question about ideal or average workloads. Is there an average or ideal workload that is the number of matters being worked on consecutively that's considered optimal for each reviewer?
We make every effort to have an equitable distribution of workload. One of the things that is challenging when you're trying to make sure that there's a fair distribution of workload amongst the officers is that you're working in both historical data and what you currently have on your desk. So you can look back to the previous year, you can look at trends throughout the year and try to anticipate the balance of workload based on the department assigned to the contracts officer. So we have a department-based assignment model here at the University of Central Florida, and we look at volume of contracts per department, per college on an annual basis, and we try to assign departments so that we have an equitable distribution workload. With that being said, you're also looking at complexity. What sort of complex agreements is that person working on? It's not something that you can make a decision and say, this is it, we're going to move forward with this permanently. It's something that needs to be reassessed on a regular basis, whether it's something that you're looking at, every 3 months. It's something that you're talking to your contracts office staff on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis during one-on-ones. How is your volume? How's things going? I see that you have X number of contracts. Are they complex? Is there anything I can do to support them? One thing that we are also looking at is an agent report. So what can we do to support our staff when a contract hits a threshold in terms of the negotiation timeline? Is this an instance where the contract died on a vine? I mean, we've all been in that position. We're negotiating a contract, it's an NDA, it's non-financial. The other party has just stopped responding for 4 months. Is this something that we need to continue to commit resources to, or can we go back to the department and PI and see if it's something that they need to continue to pursue? A lot of times that's the case. A lot of times this is something where the department, PI, the sponsor, it really didn't come to fruition, and both parties are going their own ways. Sometimes it's one of those things. Well, can we escalate this to leadership and see what we can do to move this to the middle much quicker? What can we do to follow up? Is there any escalation on the sponsor side that we can do because they're non-responsive? That's typically how we approach such issues. I see that there's a few other comments in the. Oh, I'm sorry. Is my volume coming through okay for everyone, or is it going in and out?
It's better now.
Okay.
It was a little bit noisy earlier.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So I'll go ahead and get back to sort of looking at internal opportunities. As I mentioned before, really breaking apart the negotiation timeline from those things that occur internally at your institution to those actions externally to your institution. So internally, there's a couple of different approaches you can do to look at efficiencies. Are you looking at the data, how long certain partners take to respond to a particular issue? If there's areas of campus that partner with you on the negotiation timeline, looking at that data can help you in a number of ways. Identifying appropriate roles and responsibilities. We talked about this before. Are they doing what they should be doing? Are they doing more than what they should be doing? Do they understand what their role is in the negotiation? And then documenting that. Developing service line agreements. This is an experience that I had at a couple previous institutions. But if there's a partner at your institution that is responsible for a certain area of a negotiation, are they responding? Are they providing you the information that you need as a contracts officer? If not, and there's a lack of sort of collaboration there, it may be helpful to develop a service line agreement, set expectations. What is the expectation for a response? What is the expectation for us providing that entity information? What do they need from us to be able to respond and answer our questions? Driving discussion regarding risk tolerance at your university. Are we spending too much time on a particular issue? Are we too risk adverse here because it's taking X number of days in the negotiation timeline, or weeks in the negotiation timeline? Initiating discussions about the effectiveness of a certain review. Are we doing more than we should? What do the regulations say that we need to look at in this compliance area? What is required by institutional policies? What does our office procedures require? Are these really necessary? Are these really adding value? Once you have that data as a starting point for that discussion.
So I'm listening to a FRAC conference.
If the people could go on mute if you don't have a question.
Yes, it's Florida research.
All right. One of the things about being a host is you can mute a participant, but feel free to unmute if you'd like to respond to a question or discuss any of these points. But really, data should be a starting point. What you need is to develop a partnership with these internal collaborators. And when I say internal collaborators, it's not just other areas of the office of research, other areas of campus. The entire contracts office staff are collaborators. We're all collaborating towards the same goal. And so when we're looking at these internal issues, developing a partnership with the staff, with the contracts officers is important. So Leon, I think you could speak to sort of what you've participated in terms of our tools that we're developing, processes that we're developing, and the feedback that's being solicited.
So one of the things that we discussed early on was the fact that a lot of the time that we have actually taken on each contract involves administrative work. We spend a lot of time entering records in our system, logging correspondence, etc. So at one point we decided that, hey, if we actually have somebody to do that for us, it will save us all this time that we can actually focus on something more substantial, like negotiating a contract or reviewing something. So that's what we did. We actually appointed an intake person who does all the contract intake and enters it in the system and then assigns it to the appropriate contracting officer. That it doesn't sound like it takes a lot of time, but it's surprising how much time that saved us. Even if we receive something directly from the PI or from the department, we can just forward it to the email that we use. And that person who is, her name is Peggy right now, and she's wonderful at it. She does everything in the system. So we actually, it has worked so well that we're contemplating expanding that to an outtake person that is going to take care of all the signatures, the execution part, sending it to the sponsor, things like that. It's surprising how little things like that can save us so much time. So we can actually focus on our main responsibility while all these things that are necessary to the process are handled by somebody else.
As a contracts officer, you're so focused on those complex issues. Stiliana is reviewing a contract from a federal agency and is spending time going through the hundreds of FAR and DFAR clauses that are included in the contract. Stiliana is a highly trained contracts officer, very skilled at negotiating these contracts. Yet when you have administrative responsibilities for the contracts officers, it sort of takes up that time where they could be spending their, focus on negotiating the contract, what they're experienced with. So if you find ways to minimize the amount of administrative workload that a contracts officer has, you're then able to have more time spent actually negotiating the contract. So as Stiliana mentioned, we have an intake role supporting the contracts officers. We're looking at expanding it. I do have to say there's also a benefit in that if you have someone specialized who's trained to have an intake role and enter the information into the system, you're going to have consistent data. If you have one person entering the data, it's going to be consistent. And especially if they're specialized, if that's their responsibility to enter that data and they truly understand the value of accurate data, you're going to have much better reporting. Again, going back to some of the reporting requirements that we have now as institutions, it's important that we are capturing the agreements correctly. What entity are we working with? Is that entity a domestic entity? It's a foreign entity. Are they industry? Or are they, federal agency? Are they state? Are they local? All of these data points are critical for us. And if you have one intake person managing that, you're going to have more consistent and more accurate data. Obviously, you want to have some cross-training, making sure that there's coverage so that, if something comes up, you have someone who can step in and take on that role. But it really has been beneficial to the contracts officers and really allows them to focus their attention on the complex negotiations and moving those agreements through the process. Again, though, with anything internal, early buy-in, some of the things that when we look at this data and we identify opportunities for efficiencies, reaching out to those other parties and getting early buy-in, sharing in that goal, making sure that a voice is heard. Clear communication is also important, making sure you understand what the expectations are, what you're trying to achieve, and communicating that out to your customers who may be affected by any sort of process change. If it's coming up as sort of a surprise, they may not buy in as well as they should. And if they're sharing in the responsibility for a process change, they're just as important to have buy-in. They're stakeholders, and developing those relationships with all areas of campus, department research administrators. We have an amazing group here at the University of Central Florida. It's a group of very experienced department research administrators that meet on a regular basis, provide us a forum to bring ideas to them and get their feedback. I can't say how amazing the experience is going to them with questions, sharing our information, the feedback that we receive, something that I'm going to overlook in a central office. It's critical for my colleague in the departments. I want to know that from the very beginning. I want to make sure that something is successful that we're working on. So we're really doing everything we can to make sure that when we are looking at changes, when we're looking at improving our timeline, improving our ability to capture these high-risk contracts, we involve all stakeholders as best we can. One thing though too is that these sort of efforts take time. There's progress that you're going to be making on it, but it's also not an overnight change. And some things are not going to work well. And so being able to identify when something doesn't work well when you're looking at the data and being able to pivot quickly is important.
We've got another question in the chat. Doug asked, do you sign template agreements with sponsors other than the FTP template? And in the clinical trial space, have you signed with the accelerated clinical trial agreement?
We do utilize other templates than the FTP template. Clinical trials are actually routed through our research foundation. I know that there are templates that they use for clinical trials. The Board of Trustees manages federal clinical trials, but we try to use templates as best as we can. Again, negotiating from a preferred position is better than anything else. And then with the FTP, where it doesn't require any sort of negotiation, absolutely, that's best. It may require some corrections to some of the fillable fields, maybe go back and forth on some of the project specific information, but you're not negotiating the terms and conditions. I'm a huge proponent of the FTP data transfer and use agreement. It's an amazing tool that has created a lot of efficiency when sharing data amongst institutions of higher education and other research institutions.
We've got another question. What do you think of aligning reviewers based on departments versus contract types? I know complexity and historical trends play a role, especially if department driven, but would it potentially create efficiencies to create SMEs based on contract types? I've had a manager try to implement that system, but thought it would limit or prevent learning opportunities. How do you balance that desire to potentially increase turnaround at the expense of professional development?
I think there's two issues that you need to be concerned with when you try to transition a contracts office to a sponsor assigned model or a specific contract assigned model. Not only do you have the issue of professional development to address because you have very specialized individuals who may not get the experience that they need to advance in their career, but you also don't have that partnership that you develop when you have a department-based assignment model. We have great relationships with our departments here at the University of Central Florida. We have strong partnerships between the contracts officers and the departments. The contracts officers know the PI's portfolio, they know their area, they know who to work with, they know who to reach out to, they know how to communicate with that principal investigator, how to communicate with that department. There's so much value in that department-based assignment model. The way that I could see supplementing a department-based assignment model and something that we do is that we try to leverage subject matter expertise by things like peer-to-peer training model, the sharing of information that Stiliana mentioned in the contracts office chat. So someone may be not as experienced as someone else with a federal contract, but they have that colleague that they trust and that they can reach out to get that experience to help move that contract along. So you still develop that relationship with your department counterpart and your PIs, but you're able to leverage the expertise that everyone has in their particular area. I think having something that takes from every type of model is the best way to approach structuring your contracts office. Particularly for me, I'm a huge fan of a relationship with the department. It's something that I've done at previous institutions and has worked really well here at the University of Central Florida.
We've got a follow-up comment in the chat from Felicia at our research foundation to the question about clinical trials, noting that at the moment they do use the Magi template for clinical trials, but have not used the ACTA template yet. Anyway, we also have a message from Elizabeth notifying us that they'll be closing the breakout rooms in about the next 4 minutes now. So Jeff and Stiliana, if you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share with the group, I think this would be the time.
Well, go ahead.
No, Stiliana, I was just going to say, I've really enjoyed this discussion group. It's a topic that the contracts office here is really passionate about. We want to be as effective as we possibly can, and we want to be as efficient as we possibly can. And, Stiliana, being, a very experienced contracts officer, I like to have this, be a partnership amongst the entire office. a very collaborative group where we all feel like we can engage with each other to help each other out, ask each other questions, and review the data and use the data to make these decisions so that we know when something works and when something doesn't work.
I just wanted to add on this. Collaboration is a very big, it plays enormous role. I can't even stress how much collaboration between us in the contracting office and everybody else that are involved in the process helps. And just to reiterate, it helps to, especially from a contracting person who's doing this every day, it helps that in our case, at least, leadership is willing to listen to us because we're the ones working on this every day. We're the ones, as Jeff mentioned, in the trenches dealing with it, and to hear what's working for us and what's helping us grow and develop, it makes a big difference. So I would suggest for anybody that can actually approach the subject about data with their employees and the people that are actually doing this every day, that's your first step. It helps a lot.
And just quickly at the end, following on Stiliana's comments about making sure things work well for the staff, it doesn't stop at implementing a new process. You still are responsible for following through and making sure something continues to work, because something could have an immediate positive impact, but over time is no longer working for the institution, or something comes up that breaks down the process. So once a change is implemented, I would say it's just as important to track the impact of that change on the for the university on a long-term basis. How regularly you follow up depends on the type of change that it is, but it's something that we try to do as regularly as we can and track these changes that we're working on. Fortunately, again, we have the ability to pull data on how things how long things take during the timeline. We're also able to capture comments. We're able to look at themes of reviews, issues that come up, because it's not just about numbers, it's about the content too. We want to pull out that information, look how it can provide us sort of training opportunities or areas where you need to focus our attention on when we receive comments back from a particular entity. So I would just say, in closing, really it's just as important when you're looking in the beginning as you are looking at the end. In terms of how effective an efficiency change is.
Okay, well, I think we're probably about at the end of our time. Thank you so much to everyone for joining and participating in the discussion today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Stiliana. Thank you, Becca.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.